When a character dies in a franchise, there's always a risk that their presence fades with time. But Georgie and Mandy's first marriage is doing something much smarter than that. Instead of moving on from George Cooper Sr., the show is actively proving that his relevance didn't end with his death. In fact, in many ways, George feels more important now than ever. To understand why this works so well, you have to look back at Young Sheldon. George's death was one of the most emotional turning points in that series. It wasn't just a plot device. It reshaped the entire Cooper family. Mary's faith was tested. Missy struggled in silence. Sheldon processed it through logic and distance. And Georgie, arguably, had to grow up overnight. Now, in Georgie and Mandy's first marriage, that growth is the foundation of the show. What makes George's continued relevance so compelling is that it doesn't rely on flashbacks or shock twists. The writers don't need to resurrect him physically to keep him central. Instead, they let his influence live through Georgie's choices. Every time Georgie faces a tough financial decision, every time he tries to be a steady husband, every time he steps up as a father, there's an unspoken comparison happening. He's measuring himself against the man who raised him. And that's where the emotional weight comes in. George was never portrayed as perfect. In Young Sheldon, he was flawed, sometimes misunderstood, often overwhelmed. But he was also consistent. He showed up. He worked hard. He carried the quiet burden of providing for his family. Now, Georgie is stepping into that same role, and the parallel is impossible to ignore. The genius of Georgie and Mandy's first marriage is that it explores legacy without being overly sentimental. George's absence isn't romanticized. It's practical. It's heavy. It's felt in small moments, in conversations about responsibility, in arguments about money, in the way Georgie tries to hold things together even when he's unsure. That's how you keep a character relevant after death. You let their values linger. There's also something powerful about how the show subtly reframes George. In The Big Bang Theory, adult Sheldon often described his father through the lens of childhood resentment and misunderstanding. But Young Sheldon complicated that narrative, giving viewers a fuller picture of who George really was. Now, this new series continues that rebalancing. Through Georgie's adulthood, we're seeing the parts of George that mattered most: his work ethic, his stubbornness, his quiet care. The audience is invited to reconsider him not as a flawed memory, but as a foundational influence. And then there's the emotional ripple effect on the rest of the Cooper family. Anytime there's a family gathering, or even a simple mention of the past, George becomes part of the conversation. He's the invisible thread connecting Mary, Missy, Georgie, and Sheldon. His death didn't dissolve the family dynamic, it reshaped it. And that reshaping is still ongoing. For Mandy, this is especially interesting. She married into a family still defined by a loss she didn't directly experience. So when Georgie reacts strongly to pressure or responsibility, Mandy isn't just dealing with her husband. She's dealing with the legacy of a father he's still trying to live up to. That adds depth to their marriage and prevents the show from becoming a standard sitcom about young parenthood. Instead, it becomes a story about inherited identity. Another reason this approach works is because it mirrors real life. When someone important dies, they don't disappear from your decision-making process. You still ask yourself what they would think. You still hear their advice in your head. You still carry their lessons, whether you want to or not. Georgie and Mandy's first marriage captures that feeling authentically. George remains relevant not because the plot forces him back into focus, but because the characters can't escape what he meant to them. And that's smart storytelling. Rather than closing the chapter on George Cooper Sr., the show treats his death as the beginning of a new narrative phase, one where his influence evolves instead of ending. It's not about grief alone. It's about transformation. It's about how loss shapes maturity. It's about how sons become fathers and, in doing so, start to understand their own dads in ways they never could before. By continuing to make George relevant, the series strengthens its emotional core. It reminds viewers that family history doesn't vanish. It echoes forward. And in doing that, Georgie and Mandy's first marriage proves something important. Sometimes the most powerful characters in a story are the ones who aren't physically there anymore, but whose presence is felt in every decision, every argument, and every attempt to build something better.